Welcome to this presentation for Educational Foundations 1. I will be taking you through the presentations. My name is Mukai Nyangara. Indicated are my contact details. You can contact me at 1700 hours every day. These are our open remarks. This presentation captures highlights from each of the 6 units of the module. You need to read further for details. You should also consult other sources and internet. Note that education is dynamic and you need to keep abreast with changes by reading wide. The indicated page numbers are syllabus references, meaning that the page numbers show where the material has been taken from the start guide or from our syllabus. If you have any queries, you are free to contact me by telephoning, or you can write an email to me. Right. Our first area of call in this course is on historiography. Right. What does that mean? Yes, it is a summary of the historical writings on a particular topic. For example, the history of trade, the history of the French Revolution. It sets out in broad terms the range of debate and approaches to the topic. Right, this part of history identifies the main points of that discussion, or the discussion of a particular historical event. And this adds authority or legitimacy to a history essay, as it confirms the author's familiarity with his or her topic and forces the author to acknowledge and explain disagreements with others. It's questions to be asked, or which should be asked under this area. We would need to know who writes the agenda. And we also need to know how accurate can a historian ever hope to be, analyzing past events from the vantage point of the historian's present. We also need to know that the historian's own perspectives impacted undoubtedly is by gender, age, national, and ideological affiliation. Also need to know how it contributes to an agenda that the historian's work is playing into. Right, so these are the questions we need to ask, and we can read further on page 4 of our study guide. Then we now look at what are the sources of information for historians. Where do they get information? We've got 2 types of sources. We've got primary sources and secondary sources. A source is anything that has been left behind by the past. It might be a document, it might be a building, or it might be a picture, or it might be anything which has been left behind. And these are called sources because they provide us with information. For example, we have got rock paintings by the Bushmen. Those are sources. They are regarded as sources. Then we've got also diaries which have been left by long back. They are also sources. We can also have equipment, materials, for example, clay pots which were left by long ago people. Then the primary sources are the first-hand sources. Then the secondary sources are second-hand. An example is given there, but the bottom line is that a primary source is an event which a person witnesses in person. The information collected during that is a primary source. They were given an example of a car accident. Yes. Then the description of the accident which a witness gives to the police is a primary source, because it comes from someone that actually was there at the time of the accident. Then we've got secondary sources. These are stories in newspapers. These are sources which are reported by other people. They write the story. All these are secondary sources. We can also get historical information from internet, or these are examples of secondary sources. And why do we need to study history? Yes, history offers a storehouse of information. When we say storehouse, it means it stores historical information, right? We cannot evaluate war if the nation is at peace, unless if we use historical materials. The second reason why we study history is because the past causes the present, so the future. Anytime we try to know why something happened, we have to look for factors that took shape earlier. So the past causes the present. Then history also provides stories of individuals and situations in the past. Then we can also use it to test our own moral sense, to hone it against what individuals face in difficult settings. It means to compare, to compare against what individuals faced in the difficult settings. Then it also helps us to provide identity. Yes, this is one of the reasons modern nations encourage his teaching in some form. Yes, if we want to know the present, we need to know our past. There are more reasons on why we study history. You can read page 15 of our study guide. Then let's look at comparative education. What is comparative education? This is a process where we compare our education, present education, with the past. We can also compare our education with education from other countries, right? Then comparative education attempts to use cross and national data to test propositions about the relations between education and society, and between teaching practice and learning outcomes. It considers implications of comparative studies for the formation of and implementation of policies. Comparative education invites contributions from associated disciplines in the fields of governance, management, sociology, technology, and others. As the the analytical study of these factors from a historical perspective and the comparison of an attempted solution of resulted problems are the main purpose of comparative education. Right? In simple terms, we can say when we analyze the present and the past, when we look at policies of education in the past, we can be able to identify weaknesses, we can be able to identify shortfalls so that we can use those to improve. When we look at the education system of our, Namibia and we compare it with other education systems, we can learn from other education systems, or we can adapt our education system so that it can address the current needs of our society. So comparative education simply focuses on analysis so that we can improve our education system. Right, then we've got a list of education thinkers who contributed to history of education. Yes, we have got Pilato, then we've got Augustine, then we've got Da, Felter, then we've got Pestalozzi, then we've got Dewey. And each of these thinkers or philosophers contributed to education, and currently we are using their philosophies. As, for example, Dewey is popular for pragmatism, right? And when we consider Dewey's philosophy, we are applying it when we look at the learner-centered education, practical application of education, as we are linking that to Jewish philosophy of education. So these philosophers or thinkers are of great importance when we look at the current educational practices. Then those ones were Western philosophers. Now let's look at African thinkers or philosophers. We have Nyerere, is popular for education for self-reliance. Yes, and also is credited for championing adult education or lifelong learning. Then we've got Kenyatta, who is known for the Harambee concept, meaning pulling together or working together. So he encouraged communities to work together to raise funds for all sorts of local projects. Yes. Then we have Kaunda, that is Zambia. Yes, he also instituted a policy where all children, irrespective of their parents' ability to pay, were given free exercise books, pens and pencils. The parents' main responsibility was to buy uniforms. So we remember Kaunda for championing free education and also education for all. So these philosophers or thinkers help us to trace the history of education, and their contributions guide us today. Yes, then what needs to be addressed to successfully implement the right policies for early childhood development? Right, we need to have a policy. A policy will guide us on our operations, on how to implement early childhood development education. Right, then they also need to identify the marginalized groups so that these can be brought into the mainstream society. And there's need to apply affirmative action policies and also ensure equity in access to early childhood education. Then the children should get early learning in their mother tongue with a transition strategy to move toward the school language by the time the child reaches grade 1 and beyond. Then there's need to decentralize planning so that the local needs can be captured, and also so that the intervention can be geared to or tailored to the local needs, and also to empower the local communities. Then private schools should be brought to the ambit of regulation to ensure appropriate quality among creches, daycare centers, and preschools. It simply means that if we have any private early child development centers, they should operate within the confines of the government or the Ministry of Education regulations so that the quality is maintained. Then there should be some ways of monitoring early child development programs. There should be some supervision. Then access to quality early child care and education should be fundamental right for every child, as enshrined in our national constitution. It is a fundamental right of every child. Then let's look at education for all goals. We have got 6 goals for education for all. Right. The first one is goal of number 1. It concerns expanding and improving comprehensive early childhood care education, especially for the most vulnerable and disadvantaged children. Ensuring that all children, particularly girls, especially those belonging to minority groups, who have access to free and compulsory primary education of good quality. Then goal number 3, ensuring that young people and adults are met through equitable access to appropriate learning and life skills programs. Then goal number 4 is on improvement of adult literacy, especially for women. Yes. Then goal number 5 is on equality, which concerns eliminating gender disparities in primary and secondary education. And then goal number 6 is improving all aspects of the quality of education and ensuring that recognized and measurable learning outcomes are achieved by all. And if you check, page 161 in your study guide, some of these goals were written a little bit long ago, and they have, they are saying by this year, for example, by 2015, you are already beyond 2015. So we can disregard the years, yes, because they need updating. That's why I said from the beginning, education is dynamic. All things are changing. We have goals for further year, for example, Vision 2030 and sustainable development goals. Yes, let's look at the rights and the welfare of the child. Yes, I only have 7 examples. We have got more rights. You can refer to page 169 of our study guide. Yes, a child means every human being below the age of 18 years. The child have got the rights of freedom despite race, ethnic group, color, sex, language. This is equality, right? The children have got the right to voice their opinions. They should be heard. They should be given the opportunity to be heard. They've got the right to live, the right to be named and registered at birth. They also have the right, every child who is capable of communicating his or her own views should be allowed to express his or her opinion freely. We have many more. For example, the right to health is not covered here. The right to education is not covered here. So you can read further on the rights of the child. Right, then let's look at educational policies consistent with the guiding principles. This is Unit 3. If you look at the source indicated, it will also guide you. The 3 means Unit 3, and also indicated is the page 176. Right, it is the fundamental right of every child to be provided with fullest possible educational opportunities. Then due attention should be given to learners requiring special education treatment. I think you are aware of inclusive education. This is covered. This covers special education treatment. Then all facilities should be made available equally to enable every learner to enjoy his or her right to education without discrimination. And education is the responsibility of the state. However, in a practical situation, though the state may provide free education, but there are certain needs the community may also provide to help the state. Right, then this should not be construed so as to interfere with the liberty of the parents and, when applicable, legal guardians to choose for their children's schools other than those established by the state, since education is an essential factor in economic growth. It means that parents may also choose to send their children to private schools. And now let's look at the rights of the teachers. Yes, the first right, the participation of teachers in social and public life should be encouraged in the interest of the teacher's personal development, right? Then the teachers should be free to exercise all civic rights. Then there should also be a statutory or voluntary machinery which should be established, whereby the right of teachers to negotiate through their organizations with their employers. Then there should also be appropriate joint machinery which should be used to settle disputes between teachers and their employers. And you can read further on page 180 of the study guide on the rights of teachers. Let's look at briefly at the South African colonial education. Right, let's look at the policies of the South African colonial education. Right, one of the issues is that there was no democracy. Yes, and also there was inequality between races and ethnic groups. I think you are aware of that. Then there was also some form of racial discrimination or segregation because the schools or the education was divided according to races. Right. Then the different educational systems and administrations were developed as based on three groups: the whites, blacks, and coloreds. And this also affected resources, whereby the other group was given more resources than the others. And it also influenced the quality of education. Then the education system also, there was disparity on the number of students who would proceed to secondary school. And you can read more on the colonial education in Namibia on page 199. Then let's look at socioeconomic challenges linked to education. Right. The country has been unable to provide adequate skilled human resources, and the country continues to experience high rates of unemployment and underemployment. That is a socioeconomic challenge. Right. Even if the education sector receives the largest share of the government budget, 80% of this goes to personal costs, that is salaries and the like, and less than 20% is left for capacity building, educational materials and equipment, meaning that it affects the quality of education. Yes, there's also still need to improve the conditions of learning, teaching and learning, especially in the rural areas, because some of the schools are under-resourced. And also there had been a shortage of skilled teachers in areas such as mathematics, science, and English. I think now there is an improvement. Then there's also a challenge of reaching out to educational marginalized and impoverished remote areas of the country. Then the country is also, the education has been affected by the worsening, also HIV/AIDS, which is affecting the young productive age groups, and this has impact on the human resources of the country, and also parents have been affected, resulting in a number of children becoming orphans. These are socioeconomic challenges. They are linked to education. Right, now let's look at Article 20 of the country's constitution, which is commitment to education for all. Right, this one is very clear, and we can refer to our national constitution, Article 20, which is on the right to education. Of course, it indicates that all people, persons have got the right to education, that education shall be made compulsory. Then children will not be allowed to leave school until they attained the age of 16 years. Right. Let's move on. We have Education and Training Sector Improvement Plan, which is dubbed ETSIP. Yes. What recommendations have been made by ETSIP? We need to know these. Improvement of the quality of general education from grade 1 to 12. Then provision of ICTs to enhance learning, or integration of ICT in education. Then expanding the provision of senior secondary education. Then also reforming vocational education and training. Then strengthening tertiary education. Then we also have enhancing early childhood development and pre-primary education. Then strengthening access to information, culture, and lifelong learning. Enhancing HIV/AIDS management in education. Promoting equity in education. Pursuing a capacity development program to improve all aspects of institutional development. And if you look at these recommendations which came from this commission of inquiry and came up with ETSIP, the Education and Training Sector Improvement Plan, these are some of the things which are being implemented now. If you look at the structure of the education which has been changed, if you look at the introduction of grade 0 in schools, these are some of the policies which are being implemented now. So you can read further on page 244. Then let's look at, this is Unit 6, page 233. Factors and foundations that influence educational systems. And when we look at these foundations, they either teachers need to know these foundations because they influence educational systems. Some of them fall under professional foundations. Yes. Teachers need to know economic factors, how economic factors influence education. When we look at government policies, when we look at employment, we look at natural resources and productivity, when we look at management, when we look at poverty, when we look at labor, interest rates, all these influence education in one way or another. Yes. Then we've got philosophical views. Philosophical views, every teacher, behind every school and every teacher is a set of related beliefs. A philosophy of education that influences what and how learners are taught. So the philosophical views, every teacher should know the philosophy of our education system, or the philosophy of our country, the philosophy of our political forces. What are we aiming? For example, when we look at quality, when we look at citizenship education, all these are part of our philosophy. What type of learner do we want to produce? Then historical developments, we have already discussed about history and how it influenced the current. If we look at, we have looked at comparative education. If we look at the colonial education system, the moment we analyze it, it will help us to shape today's education system. We will not repeat the mistakes which were done in the previous education system. Right, then educational psychology insights. I think as trained teachers or trained teachers, we know what is educational psychology. It helps us to study the needs of learners. It helps us to handle the learners accordingly. We analyze our learners and we are able to say what learning materials should we give them, how can we control them, how can we discipline them, how can we manage their behavior. All these fall under psychology, educational psychology. Right, then we've got society features and issues. First of all, one must acknowledge that the story of the community needs to be understood within its own unique political and cultural. We need to know the background of our students, where they come from, what type of society, what happens in the society, so that we can help them. Thank you. We are done. Wish you the best.